The text arrives at 6:40 in the evening. Plans for tonight are canceled. Something came up. They're sorry. Next time for sure. And before the reply is even typed, before the polite, no worries, all good, is sent back, something happens in the body that has nothing to do with politeness at all. The shoulders drop. Not dramatically. Half an inch, maybe less. The kind of drop that happens before a decision is made, not after it. That's the part nobody talks about. Not the canceled plan. The relief that shows up before the guilt does the guilt that's supposed to come first, that's supposed to say you should be disappointed right now. Instead, there's an exhale that feels like something finally being allowed to stop. Nobody teaches a person to feel that. Nobody sits a child down and says, someday a plan will fall through and part of you will be glad. It happens quietly, the way most true things about a person happen, underneath the version of the story they tell out loud. This isn't about being antisocial. It isn't about hating people or being broken or needing to work on it. Something got built a long time ago, and it got built for a reason, and the shoulders dropping tonight are just the reason showing up again, decades later, in an apartment that's about to be empty and quiet in a way that feels less like loneliness and more like arriving somewhere. There's a version of childhood that doesn't get talked about much. Not the version with a single dramatic event, not the version with a clear before and after. Just a house where being around people took a certain kind of effort that never fully switched off. Reading a room before entering it. Tracking a tone of voice for the first 4 words of a sentence to know what was coming next. Adjusting posture, volume, timing, without ever being told to, without ever deciding to, the way a hand pulls back from something hot before the brain has finished registering pain. Being around other people meant being on, and being alone meant being off. That's the whole thing, actually. That's the entire mechanism, stripped down to its simplest form. Not a dislike of people, a nervous system that learned early and thoroughly that other people required monitoring, and that monitoring is exhausting in a way that doesn't show up on the surface. Because it isn't the exhausting kind of tired that comes from doing too much. It's the tired that comes from watching too much. A child doesn't decide this. There's no moment of choosing solitude over connection. No conscious little verdict handed down. What happens instead is smaller and slower. 100 instances of connection costing more than it gave back, until the body starts doing the math on its own, without asking permission. A raised voice from another room that had nothing to do with anyone in particular, but got filed away anyway. A silence at dinner that meant something, even if nobody said what. Enough of those, close enough together, and a pattern writes itself without needing a single dramatic scene to justify it. Being around someone became a transaction with a fee attached. Being alone was the only place the fee didn't apply. And here's the part that actually explains the grown adult standing in a quiet apartment tonight, feeling relief instead of disappointment. A nervous system that learns to associate people with vigilance doesn't unlearn it just because the original reason is gone. It doesn't check whether the room is safe now. It generalizes. It applies the old rule to new rooms, new people, new plans that get canceled on a Tuesday by someone who was never a threat at all. The rule doesn't update itself. It just keeps running, quietly, in the background. Long after the situation that wrote it has ended. The way a smoke alarm that saved a house once will still go off for burnt toast for the rest of its life because it was never built to tell the difference. It was only ever built to react. That's the first thing worth sitting with. Not I'm introverted. Something closer to a system built to keep a child safe is still operating in adults' evenings. Still deciding what counts as rest and what counts as risk using information that's 20, 30 years out of date. It's uncomfortable to look at directly, so most people don't. It's easier to call it a personality trait. Easier to say, I've just always been like this, than to ask what like this was actually protecting against. And there's a kind of comfort in the personality trait version. It doesn't ask anything else of you. It closes the question instead of opening it. Here's the part that's harder to hear, and it deserves to be said carefully because it isn't an accusation. It's just true. The preference for solitude wasn't really a preference. Not at first. It was a strategy, the only reliable one available at the time. A child who can't control who walks through the door, what mood they're in, whether affection today comes with conditions attached, will eventually find the one variable they can control. Being alone. The one room where nothing unpredictable is going to happen, because nothing is happening at all. Solitude became safety not because solitude is inherently peaceful, but because it was the only environment that didn't require guessing. And a child who spends enough years guessing will eventually choose the room with no guessing in it, every single time, without ever framing it as a choice. It doesn't feel like avoidance from the inside. It feels like preference. It feels like personality. That's what makes it so hard to question later. It was never presented as a decision, so it never feels like one that could be reconsidered. This is where it gets complicated in a way that doesn't resolve neatly. Because that strategy worked, it genuinely worked, it got a child through years that might have been much harder without it. And now, as an adult, the same strategy shows up uninvited in situations where it isn't needed anymore, quietly costing something it once used to save. A friendship that could have gone deeper if the audit hadn't kicked in halfway through the conversation. A relationship that stayed one careful layer above where it could have been. It's hard to be angry at a coping mechanism that did its job. It's also hard to keep living inside one that's overstayed its welcome. Both of those things are true at the same time, and there isn't a clean way to hold them that makes the discomfort go away. Some things just sit there, unresolved, and the honest move is to let them. Here's the angle almost nobody names, though. The thing underneath the thing. It isn't really about people at all. It's about performance. Somewhere along the way, being around others got quietly linked to being watched. And being watched for long enough starts to feel identical to being evaluated. Every interaction carries a faint audit running underneath it. Was that the right thing to say? Did that come out wrong? Are they annoyed, bored, already regretting inviting me? The audit is so old and so automatic that it doesn't even register as an audit anymore. It just feels like normal social awareness. The ordinary hum of being a person around other people. Most people don't hear it running. This kind of person hasn't heard it stop in years, but alone, the audit shuts off. Not because there's nothing to think about, but the mind is often loudest exactly when the room is quietest, but because there's no one there to perform for. And that's the actual thing being sought most evenings when a canceled plan lands like relief instead of disappointment. Not distance from people, distance from being observed. Which means the story a person tells about themselves, I just need my space, I recharge alone, I'm not really a people person, is true, but only on the surface. Underneath it is something closer to, I learned that being around others means being assessed, and I have spent my whole life mistaking the absence of an audience for the presence of peace. That reframes the canceled plan completely. It was never really about the plan. It was about one evening where nobody would be checking. There's something almost tender in that, once it's named. A child who adapted so completely to being watched that the child grew into an adult who now treats an empty room like a reward. Not because the child was weak, because the child was resourceful, in the only direction available. The same alertness that once scanned a room for danger now just scans it for judgment. Softer, but the same wiring still working overtime for a threat that mostly isn't there. It would be simple to end here with a clean answer. Go make more plans, push through the discomfort, prove the old rule wrong. That's not quite honest, though. It isn't obvious how much of this can actually change, or how much of it just gets carried a little differently once it's understood. Maybe the relief when a plan cancels never fully disappears. Maybe it just stops meaning what it used to mean, stops being evidence of something broken, and starts being evidence of something that made perfect sense once, in a house that no longer exists. What does seem to shift, when this gets looked at honestly, is the guilt. The guilt was always the part that didn't belong there in the first place. A leftover expectation that solitude should feel like a failure to connect, instead of what it actually is for a lot of people. The only room where the audit finally goes quiet. Tonight, the apartment stays empty, the shoulders stay dropped, and somewhere underneath that quiet, small and easy to miss, is a kind of exhale that was earned a long time ago, by someone much younger, who didn't have the words for any of this yet, and is, in a strange and delayed way, still being thanked for it now. It's a strange thing to make peace with. Not fully solved, just a little more understood than it was an hour ago. If any part of this felt familiar, say so in the comments. What did solitude look like for you growing up? And does it still feel like the same thing now? And if this one landed the way it was supposed to, give it a like, send it to someone who might see themselves in it too, and stick around and subscribe. There's more of this kind of honesty coming.